Hi, I'm Sudeep Muthedat, Senior Principal Architect at Carta. Welcome to this video that's continuation of our Azure series. In the previous video, we saw the challenges with running applications on-prem and the benefits of migrating them to Azure Spring Apps. Now, let me introduce Mike Richter and David Giard from Microsoft to talk more about Azure Spring Apps.
Hi, I'm David Giard. I'm a cloud solution architect with Microsoft.
And I'm Mike Richter, a cloud solution architect at Microsoft.
Mike, in the last video, we saw a lot of information about Azure Spring Apps, which is a way of deploying Spring applications, Java Spring applications to Microsoft Azure. And I think a lot of people watched that and thought to themselves, Microsoft? Java? I think there's a perception that those two things really don't belong together, but I think that's an incorrect perception.
I think that's a good point, right? And if you would have asked me about Microsoft and Java a few years ago, I'd also be hard for me to kind of answer that question, right? But today, Microsoft has a really great story when it comes to Microsoft enabling and modernizing Java applications in the cloud, right? Think about our partnerships first, right? We've got Oracle, we partner with VMware, with Red Hat, and we've taken their Java capabilities and built those into our Azure services, right? Like Azure services like Azure Kubernetes Service, Azure Red Hat OpenShift, Azure Functions, Azure App Service. You could do all your Java stuff there, right? And even several of our Azure services now are running on Java. And when you think of some of our products like LinkedIn runs on hundreds of Java microservices, and Minecraft is built on Java as well, right? And when it comes to developers, Microsoft has an even better story for Java, right? We've got Visual Studio Code, great IDE for Java. You can do all your Java app lifecycle management stuff inside of Azure DevOps or inside of GitHub, right? Microsoft has our own build of the Java Open JDK now, right? Which is optimized for Azure. That's pretty exciting. And then we have Azure SDKs in Java for all our Azure services. So if you're building apps in Java that have to talk and manage Azure, the SDK is there for you, right? And then we have Spring Cloud Azure, right? So these are Spring Cloud dependencies that make it really easy for Spring developers to use Azure services inside of their solutions.
Wow, that is a lot. A lot of Java support from Microsoft. But let's focus on Spring.
Okay.
Spring is a popular framework for building Java applications. Where does that fit into this whole Azure story?
Yeah, that's where Azure Spring Apps and Azure Spring Apps Enterprise fits in really perfectly, right? And those services were designed in partnership between Microsoft and VMware as a platform, as a service, and Microsoft and VMware support that today. And as a platform, as a service offering, it's actually kind of unique, right? When you think about PaaS, that's specifically for
Platform
Spring.
as a service?
Yeah, for Spring applications, it's unique in the industry when you think about it. So.
A lot of people today are building Spring applications either on-premise or in other clouds.
Right.
How easy is it to deploy those to Microsoft Azure?
I mean, it's super easy, right? I think that's the nature of Spring itself, right? And as we'll see in the video series, you could take a standard Java Spring app like the Clinic app and move it to Azure Spring Apps with really no code changes, right? In fact, with just a few config changes and using that Azure Spring Cloud dependency library, I think life gets even easier for the customer to move to Azure and take advantage of all the other Azure managed services, right? So if they've got databases and caching and messaging in their solution, they can use the Azure managed versions of those applications really easily with no code changes.
I noticed that in Azure Spring Apps, there are multiple tiers. I think it's the basic, standard, and enterprise. What does enterprise offer that the other ones don't?
That's a good question. So basic and standard utilize open source components, right? So modules like service discovery or configuration, and those capabilities are built into Azure Spring Apps. So customers don't have to worry about standing those up or managing them, right? Now, some customers are going to bring apps to Azure Spring Apps that are coming from PCF or from Tanzu, and those have certain commercial modules And up until, before we had enterprise, it was difficult to migrate those solutions to Azure Spring Apps because we didn't support those modules inside of ASA. But now we have that. And so now customers who do need those commercial components can bring those apps to Azure Spring Apps.
Oh, commercial components. Is there licensing involved? How does that work?
Yes, right. So for Azure Spring Apps, the basic and standard tier, the licensing, there's no licensing. You're just paying for kind of the underlying cloud infrastructure that it runs on, right? Now for the enterprise tier, there is going to be an additional per CPU hour cost for the commercial license, but only for the modules that the customers need. So I think there's 8 supported modules, and the customers just pay that license for the ones that they need.
If I deploy an Azure Spring app, how does that integrate with the rest of Azure?
Yeah, I mean, Azure Spring Apps is a first-party Azure service. So let me show you, right? If I put Azure Spring Apps or Azure Spring Apps Enterprise, I deploy that in Azure, right? I get a VNet, put it around there. So now it's on a VNet, just like any other Azure compute service, right? And then it could talk to all the other Azure services as if it's any other Azure service, right? So if I've got some kind of Azure database that I wanted to talk to, I can talk to that, and then I can use managed identity, right? So I get all the benefits of the Azure control plane here. If I have a storage account and I want to talk to it privately, I can use private endpoints once I'm in this VNet, right? All that's available to me. If I want to use Key Vault for security and compliance reasons, I can access that as well from there.
Excellent. Now, when I think about Azure, I think about things like scalability, reliability,
Right.
Automatic monitoring. Does Azure Spring Apps take advantage of those things?
Yeah, of course, right? So you might be familiar with Azure Autoscaler, right? So you can use this like in Kubernetes and VM scale sets and app service. You can use Autoscaler with ASAE, so you can start to add more instances, as the load comes in, right? And take the instances away as the load goes down, right? You've got Azure Monitor, right? So you can make sure the app is performing well, detect errors, all that great monitor and observability, right? Take advantage of that. That actually works really great. We'll see in another video series, right? And as far as kind of reliability, ASA comes with a 99.9% SLA. But that's deployed in one region, right? And of course, you could put a Azure front door in front of this. Right? Let's say we're in the east here, and you can build another instance of this in the west, and you now have global resiliency and redundancy if you need it. So anything you can build with any other Azure service for any reliability, resiliency requirements, you can do with Azure Spring Apps as well.
This is awesome. But everything you've drawn here is inside of Azure. There are a lot of applications that also access data or services that are either on-premise or in another cloud or somewhere outside of Azure. How does that work?
Yeah, so again, you are in a VNet here. So you can talk to on-prem, right? If you create a VPN or express route or even Azure Relay, you can talk to services on-prem. And of course, if you've got services in another cloud, you can do that all privately through your VNet connections. Yeah.
Very cool. This has been really educational.
Yeah, you got it.
Let's send it back to Sudeep at Carta.
Thank you, Mike and David. As you have seen, Azure Spring Apps is a great solution for migrating your on-prem Spring Boot applications to the cloud. Thanks for watching this, and join us for the next video where we will demo the application migration.